sound levels and things like that. Okay, sounds good. Okay, so I guess we can get started now. I got the thumbs up. Go ahead. So welcome. I think the last time I came to a brown bag, there was somebody else giving an awkward intro for the guy who was presenting. So I was happy to hear that I get to introduce myself. So hi, my name's Tommy Bay. I've been with STG a little over 2 years. I'm a user experience consultant, and I've had the chance to work with some really great clients. Currently, I'm working with WCF Insurance. We've got a couple of our guys here in the back, and it's been an awesome client. It's actually a really interesting client. It's a 100-year-old company. They were formed as part of the Utah state government to write workers' compensation insurance policies. And 25 years ago, they became a for-profit company so they could do insurance in other states. And then just this last year and this year, they're going to try doing something new that they haven't done in 100 years, which is do something besides workers' compensation fund insurance. So it's a fun time to be involved because there's a lot of change. IT is changing a lot, and they are looking into user experience and how that works. So it's been a lot of fun. Anyway, so that's me. My big news lately is that a couple weeks ago, my wife had a baby, and this is the new addition. It doesn't look like the same kid, but it is, I promise. Awake versus asleep, and for those of you who have had newborns, they are kind of different creatures, awake and asleep. So I guess that makes sense. Anyway, but as much as I wish I were here to tell you the story of my son, and he came as an emergency C-section, so it was pretty crazy, and I would love to show you the pictures of that crazy experience, but I won't. Instead, I will talk to you about this fella here, Jeff Patton. So a couple of months ago, I went to some workshops just locally here. They were put on by Front, if you're familiar with Front Conference. They do a big case study event in the spring, then in the fall they do workshops. So I signed up and went and attended, and it was a little hit and miss, honestly. They had tracks for product leadership, product management, user experience, and research. And so you could sign up for whatever. I went to a number of these workshops. Some of them were not good, but some of them were really good. And the best one, the one that was the most interesting to me that I walked away thinking about, was user story mapping. And before going to this workshop, I had never heard of it. I didn't know what it was at all. But this guy literally wrote the book on user story mapping, and he came and told us about it. And he says that he didn't invent user story mapping. It was something that he was doing and thought he had invented something until later on he found out that other people were doing the same thing. So he says now he identified a pattern, codified it, and wrote a book about it. So he's kind of the authority. It was really interesting to learn from him. So a lot of what I'll share with you are things that he talked to us about, and then kind of what I've learned as I've experimented and whatnot. So user story mapping. How many of you have heard of user story mapping? Okay. For those of you who have how many of you have actually built a user story map or gone through that kind of an exercise? I know Dallin has. I've photographic proof. Okay, great. So this is kind of new territory for most of us. Like I said, this was new to me, and I kind of formulated some questions that might be helpful to have answered for pretty new to this whole thing. So I've got 8 questions that I'll address in the next 40 minutes. But I have a lot more questions than that. I am by no means an authority on this stuff. I have a lot of questions on how it works practically. So I'll share some of those additional questions in the end. But if this seems like something that might be of benefit to you and your teams, I would encourage you to do the research and do some experiments and see how you can make use of it. Okay, so first question, what is user story mapping? User story mapping is the practice of mapping user stories. Right? So user stories are something that we talk about a lot in agile development. This is typically how we think of user stories. They fit into this mold. It basically says a user wants to do something for some reason. And when you write a user story, it typically fits into this framework. As a guy who mows lawns, I want an app that tracks which lawns I mowed so that I can build those people. I made that up just now. So you fit that in, and that's what you build from. In Agile, it defines user stories more like this. User stories are part of an Agile approach that helps shift the focus from writing about requirements to talking about them. All Agile stories include a written sentence or two, and more importantly, a series of conversations about the desired functionality. So if we get too focused on just that statement, then we're kind of missing the boat, because it's really about the conversation. It's talking about those things. So user story mapping, in my mind, is that. It's putting together a series of stories and talking about them so that you can understand them better. What does mapping look like? Time for an exercise. I need a couple of people, let's say three people who have never done a mapping exercise before, which is everyone except for you and you, pretty much. This is easy. You don't have to talk or do anything awkward. You just have to write some stuff down on sticky notes. There you go. Okay.
No, it wasn't.
Okay, who else? Okay, so this is what I want you to do. Think about your experience this morning of waking up and getting ready to leave the house. And that's it. I want you to write on the sticky notes the steps that you took to, like, from when you woke up, you know, things like hit snooze again, you know, whatever it is that you did this morning, up until you left the house. Okay, and I'll give you just a few minutes, 3 minutes to jot those down. So just put one step per sticky note, just pile them up. Once we do that, we'll put them up on this wall over here. So Post-its, Sharpies, this is one of the most common ways to map, but it's not the only way. Some people use index cards. The nice thing about Post-its and index cards, and why you see them used so much in the UX disciplines, is because they come with some inherent values. You can sequence things and move them around without having to do a lot of erasing or rewriting. You can establish hierarchy really easily. Anyway, it's a common way, but you could also map on a whiteboard. You could write it on a piece of paper or use a computer program, whatever. So typically, when you're coming up with these things, you're going to be writing short verb phrases, like, you know, little things like, well, like if you're defining taking a shower, you're turning on the water, you're prepping the loofah, you're scrubbing shampoo into your hair, you're drying off, right? And typically not just nouns. You're not seeing things like the shower, faucet, soap, shampoo. Like when you think about a story, you're thinking about the actions that take place. Does that make sense? And this is kind of a poignant thought, because a traditional backlog building approach is a lot of times just like a list of features, and it's kind of stagnant. So interesting to think about the difference between telling a story and making a list of features. Okay, let's map. Are you guys good? Oh, that's okay. Do you guys want another couple minutes?
I had to take over Jonathan, I believe, so
You guys,
mapping out what Jonathan did for us to have today.
I'm glad you know all about what Jonathan did this morning. Okay, so bring up what you got. It doesn't have to be complete, but bring it up here, and we're just going to stick these to the wall here. Now, again, the reason why I wanted to do this was just to illustrate. It's a pretty simple, a pretty simple exercise where you just. I don't know what Brian did this morning.
I left a lot of stuff out here.
Jonathan did a lot of really weird things this morning.
I cannot wait to see. So as you put things up here, try to align with what's already here. So fit yours into the context of the story that's being told. So maybe brush teeth happens before a shower,
Okay,
maybe.
okay.
So that you're making a cohesive map together.
Might take the bed before he brushes his teeth.
So essentially what we're doing is we're taking multiple stories, like Jonathan's experience, lived vicariously, or however that happened, is not the same as anybody else's experience, probably. But as you put the stories together, you start to get a feel for generally what happens when you get ready, right? And you can start looking for the commonalities, things that happen to everybody, and the outlying things that are less common. And as you explore multiple stories, more and more stories, and add to a map, you start to get a more and more clear idea of what is actually going on, right? More of a holistic story. Okay, we'll let Matt add his as he's available. So collaboration is super important, and it's good to pay attention to how you're collaborating. We talk about this first point a lot in usability testing, which is we can't read your mind. Like if I put a prototype in front of a user and I say, all right, let's see if you can do X or Y, and then they just click around, I have no idea if they're confused, if they're looking for something that they can't find. So it's important to externalize your thinking, talk out loud. But try not to say too much, just because you don't want to verbalize every thought that you have in your head. You try to be conscientious of the group that is collaborating. Also, don't overanalyze. Typically, when you're deciding where these things go, your intuition will tell you where things should go better than thinking and churning. Should it be here? The point is to get it up there and get it mapped out so that you can then work with the map. Fewer people is typically best. What we just did here, sometimes you would call it a fishbowl approach to collaboration. So if you've got a big room, and I wish I would have known this concept when we were doing our exercise the other day. The fishbowl concept is basically you've got a bunch of people, too many that can actually have a conversation together, like in this setting here. If we were all talking and trying to figure out our mornings and putting it together, that would be a hot mess. But if you pick just a few people, 3 or 4, and they represent the conversation, they go up, they do the exercise while everybody else listens, then you all get the benefit of being a part of the conversation without actually creating more noise. And then you can tag people in and out if you've got something that Ron's just dying to say, cleaned my fish tank this morning, that was part of my routine, then he can tap in and say, this I think is important for me. Okay. Anyway, and then time box and satisfice. That's the concept of just saying, don't be infinite about how much time you're spending. Say, okay, let's work on this map for 60 minutes and then see how we're doing. And then after that 60 minutes, you say, okay, how do we feel? Like, is this sufficient for us? Or do you think we need to do a little more? A little more? Okay, let's take 15 more minutes and add to this map. And after that, let's check and see, like, is this sufficient? Do we feel good about where this is? Rather than just going and going and going. That's what satisfice means. It means to temporarily check and see if you are in a good enough place to be done. Okay, so you form a story basically by having a starting point and an ending point. It's interesting how it naturally breaks down into the steps of the story. Okay, so why should we use story mapping? I think I've alluded to a couple of points, but really there are two main problems that we're trying to solve with user story mapping. The first is cake decorators. Not really, but follow me for just a second. Let's say that we need a cake. Our friend Suzanne is leaving, and we want to get her a cake. So we call up the bakery and we say, "Hey, I need a cake with orange and yellow roses. If you could write on it, best wishes, Suzanne. Underneath that, we will miss you." They say, "Great, we've jotted down a note for our cake decorator. You can come and pick this up on Thursday." I say, "Great." You go in on Thursday, and this is what you pick up. Best wishes, Suzanne. Underneath that, we will miss you. Not an isolated case, sadly. Hey, I want a giant cookie with colorful frosting. It should say, "So long, Alicia," in purple, with stars around it. I love the stars. They're very, very colorful. Musical notes. Happy birthday, Amber. Or happy birthday with balloons and crap like that on it. So what is the real problem here? Documents don't work the way you think they do. Just because you think you all agree, you might not. Obviously, the note taker and the cake decorator were not on the same page, even though they had the same document guiding their actions. Oftentimes, we think we agree, and then once we get it out there, we're like, "Oh, that is not what I was thinking." We really need a mapping process to talk it out. It's about the conversation. And once you can get it out there, you can start to find alignment, and then you can walk away with something that you can actually agree on. So we use collaboration, we use storytelling, simple visualizations, stuff like that, to build shared understanding, and that helps us to solve problems, create that alignment. So that's the first big benefit of user stories. The second is there are always too many requirements. Let me walk you through this little chart here. So this is now. And right now, we've got a business. They're not super happy because there are problems with their product. Their users are sad or frustrated or downright confused about the product that they're using. So what do? Well, as individuals who work with products, we do our thing, right? We start saying, "Well, I've got ideas. Let's create some requirements, some specs. Let's make some wireframes, and let's flow this thing out." And you end up building products and features, and eventually you make a release, and that release goes out, and hopefully users are happier. Some may still be indifferent, or some may still be frustrated because you didn't fix their problem. But overall, if you put something good out, then the business is happy because numbers start going up. So there's a difference here between what comes of your work and the work that you actually do. The difference between output and outcome, and ultimately the impact that outcome has. What we want to do is minimize the amount of stuff that we are actually producing, but then maximize the outcomes, right? Do as little as possible while getting the biggest bang for your buck. That's what we should all be focused on. I know a lot of times we think that the goal of product development is to develop products, but that is not true. Our goal is not to develop products, it's to solve problems. And if we can find the most efficient, the simplest ways to do that, to solve problems in a beneficial way, then we're winning, right? Because you will never have enough time, money, resources to build everything, ever. That's just, doesn't happen. Okay, so that's the second problem that mapping can help us with. It's identifying the smallest amount that's going to give us the biggest impact. Okay, I threw this in because my son is really into Homestar Runner right now. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Stinko Man here, but there are some challenges to mapping as well. So what challenges does user story mapping introduce? Well, you have to collaborate. That's kind of the point. And some organizations are going to struggle with that. Just put these out here. You may not have the space to actually do collaborative work. You may be in different time zones. Your teams may just hate collaborating. That's a possibility. Whatever it is, there may be obstacles in the way of collaborating and collaboration. So it's up to you. If this is something that you want to try to do, you've got to figure out how to make collaboration possible. That's the first problem. Or challenge, not really a problem, but something that you have to work through. The other is to specify. This is basically, these are the traditional ways that we capture the details of our conversations. Just because you build a map does not mean that you've worked through all of the details and that you can explain simply what needs to be done. There are other supporting documents that need to be made. You got to make wireframes and you've got to model things out. You've got to create personas and have those kinds of documentation to refer to and to work with. So that's the other thing. Mapping isn't a solve-all for everything. Yeah, like I said. Okay, so what is the process for mapping? Well, we went through a super simple exercise here, but let me walk you through an example of the process. So this is Gary. Gary is from South Africa. He's a jazz musician. He moved to New York to make it with his band, his music, and he was creating intros and outros for programs like the Oprah Winfrey Show. I don't know if you like any of those shows that cut in and out of commercials and stuff. Like they buy up little chunks of music, kind of like if you were, doing a marketing campaign and you would buy clip art or stock photography, that kind of thing. So that was his job. But at nights he was a band manager trying to promote his band and get gigs and whatnot. Anyway, he had an idea for a piece of software that would make his life way easier. He called it the Music Industry Marketing Interface, or MIMI. Ended up calling it Mad Mimi. And he did what a lot of people with great ideas do. He found a developer and got him on the phone and said, hey, I've got an idea. I want to build this thing. Can you help me? And the dev was like, absolutely. why don't you make a list of priority or a list of features and prioritize them for me and send it over and we'll get started. He was like, sweet, I will do that. Or whatever they say in South Africa for sweet. So he said, let's do it and send it over. And, 8-9 months later, he's not seen any releasable software. He's hemorrhaging money, but they're still working away trying to figure out how to release something. Anyway, he was pretty frustrated. Through a mutual friend, he got lined up with this Jeff Patton guy. And they got together. Jeff Patton went over to his loft in New York, and he said, all right, let's talk. Let's have a conversation. Why don't you tell me about your business? Tell me what your goals are. What's your aspirations? What's your vision for this thing? And they just talked. They had a conversation. And he said that he started, he calls it talk and doc. So Jeff stressed this in our workshop, that as good as your memory is, you will always forget things. Ideas tend to vaporize after a few minutes of being expressed. So it's super important to write things down. So he had index cards and he was writing down as they were having this conversation. Okay, this is your primary goal. Here are other goals. Here's your vision. Here's your aspirations, and was compiling all of these cards. He was helping him to frame the idea. Once they had established that stuff, they moved on to talking about the users. He said, so who's going to use this thing? Who's the customer that's going to actually buy this? And why would they buy it? What's in it for them? What benefits come from using this product? So they talked through their customers and their users. And they ended up coming up with 7, I think, user types through their conversation. Different people who would have reasons to come in and use this product, or the admin who has to administrate the system. Once they got those cards put out, Jeff said, okay, I can see that your vision for this product is pretty massive. What if you could only focus on one of these user types and really thrill them? But that was the focus rather than all 7 of these guys. And so they picked one, and then they started telling stories. This is the main part of the actual map itself. But this is when you start talking about people's experiences. What was your morning like this morning? Tell me about a user and why they struggle with this thing. And he's taking notes, and he's saying, all right, if they could come and use your software to solve this problem, what does that mean? Taking notes. And they're mapping this thing out. Now, as they went along, there were a couple of places where Gary was more passionate. He was a band manager, and so when it came to talking about promoting your band in New York, he started talking about how there's this interesting phenomenon of putting flyers on lampposts and the range of flyers. Some looked like they were scotch taped together and photocopied, and others were really elegant. And anyway, he went into all this detail about this part, and of course he captured those details, but he kept reminding him the idea now is to think mile wide and inch deep. Let's tell the story and get to an end. So kept him on track. They made it to a certain point. They did their satisfice check and said, all right, this is a lot, and this seems like it's the core of what you're wanting to do. Do you want to keep going? Should we keep, they had been putting the cards on the floor and were running out of floor space. He said, or are we good? And Gary said, no, I think you're right. I think this should be good. So after they established the story, Then they went back and explored the details and the different options, and started giving some depth to the map. So that's, in a nutshell, the process. It's pretty straightforward. It's really about having a conversation and building that shared understanding. Probably if a stranger off the street came in and looked at the map on the floor, they could have a vague idea of what it meant, but really it was a representation, or a reminder rather, to those two who had had the conversation of what they understood about the project. Incidentally, Mad Mimi ended up being a successful product. When I researched it, it actually is not specific to the music industry. So just kind of an aside, mapping can help you gain clarity on what you're building, and as you're going, you can pivot. You can follow the successes, and this ended up being an email marketing platform rather than a music band marketing engine or whatever it was going to be. Okay, so what does a map look like? This is Gary's map spread across the floor. You can see that they started having to do like a second row down here because they were running out of space. This part they call the backbone of the map, which basically tells the story. And then this is often referred to as the walking skeleton. I don't know why they call it that, but these are the details. If we could actually see these cards, you would see, like, here's a persona card, so we know that we're talking about this type of user, and they're creating a list of fans, and they create promotional email for an upcoming gig, and down here they're sending it, and then we've got another persona card here, which is the fans, and now we can see where they're overlapping in the story, and see the promos, and share with their friends. So you can see, like, this is how the story flows together. The cool thing about mapping, also that John and I were noticing when we went through it, is that it surfaces holes that you didn't know you had. The sad thing about Gary's story is that they built this great map, and when they were done, Jeff said, "So this map is great. I think we understand what you need to do. How much of this here is in the software that your developers have been developing for the last 9 months?" And he said, "Almost none. Almost none of it." He said, "I wish that I would have started looking at this holistically rather than just jotting down features that I thought we needed." So anyway, that's what a map looks like. Hey, look, it's down. This is a map that we started making a few weeks ago, a month ago. It's been a while. But same kind of anatomy. We didn't have different colored sticky notes, so we just outlined ours. These are our personas. And these are the key steps. These are the main actions. And then these are the steps that, and then the details that we started putting together.
I like the frowny face.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And maps can be small too. I've seen a few examples of this. This is one that John and I made, where, I mean, sure, we went through it like it was pretty simple, but it helped us visualize how this feature worked. So again, this is typically how it's organized. You've got your core actions here. This would be took a shower, and the steps would be the, got in, turned it on, soaked up my loofah, and then the details and the different options. This might be, well, sometimes I use apple scented, and sometimes I use lavender or whatever, right? Like, you can capture as much detail as you want, and you have it there so that you can consider it. Okay, how do I decide what to include in the map? This is a good question. That I think what I've gathered is that part of it comes from focus. right? Like Jeff and Gary, he said, okay, if you can only focus on one user type, who's it going to be? And then let's really get clear about their story. Maybe that's one way to determine. Another way is this. It's called an opportunity canvas. It's a way to clarify ideas. So I think a lot of us expect that stories, like we're taught that stories should be a certain way when they go into our backlogs or whatever, that they should follow a certain format, that they should be, you know, a small enough chunk that you could build it in 2 to 3 days, or a reasonable amount of a sprint or an iteration. Maybe that they have to have acceptance criteria, so you know when you're done, and QA knows what to test against, right? And that's true, but the problem is ideas don't show up that way. Ideas show up as big, messy things that we have to work through and figure out. So something like an opportunity canvas can help you sort through ideas. You don't need anything as formal as this, but this can help clarify things and help you through the process. But ideally, you would be killing most of your ideas before they ever hit development. Because what's our goal? Is our goal to build everything? No. Our goal is to build the least amount possible with the greatest impact. So you want to be really careful as you're considering ideas so that you don't end up building a bunch of stuff you don't need. Is that a question?
The question's popped in my mind. In the case of showering, a great use case, I can think that through and capture everything that I do. In the case of software development, you avoid confirmation. If you're telling the user stories, how do you make sure this doesn't become your own list of features? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So his question was, just in case the microphone isn't picking him up, how do you avoid bias in your storytelling? And that's a great question. I think the collaboration is a big part of that. Also, making sure that you're working from research also. I think one of my big takeaways about the mapping process is that it's not an isolated incident. It's not like you build your map and then you tear it down and throw it away and you say, okay, I think we all understand a little better. The ideal would be that you build a map and then you work on it. You say, all right, here's a hole we're not sure about, and here's some outlying information. This seems sketchy. Let's go and do some research. Let's go and ask some more users. Let's fill this in with more substance. But that's a really good question. Another question that I have, which is similar, is what do you do with an existing backlog? Like if I walk into a project and I'm like, hey, let's do story mapping. And they're like, well, okay, but we're not starting from scratch. We have, 300 items in our backlog. I'm still very curious about how does that factor into the conversation. Obviously in Gary's example with Jeff, they just ignored the backlog entirely and built their map, and then kind of lamented that they didn't sync up. That these are not the same. But it seems to me like that's not very practical, because you still have to, you've still got developers who are working on stuff. So anyway, good question. I think that adds to some of my own questions about, we have understanding or we have a backlog. How do we take that and then build something that enhances our understanding and guides us to making better decisions in the future? Good question. And when this was explained to me, basically they said, don't worry about filling out every piece, but if you're skipping boxes because you just don't know, those might be red flags for, killing an idea because you don't know it.
So I'm not familiar with this concept. Can you give us like a 10-second on how do you use this?
Sure.
Tell me.
Yeah.
Repeat the question so people online can hear what you're saying.
Absolutely. So his question was, how would you use this? Can we walk through it real fast? So I've never done this exercise personally, but this is my understanding. You would start with either an idea for a solution or maybe a problem that you've identified. And you probably do this the same way as you would do mapping, sort of. Like you can write sticky notes and just stick them here or fill it out, however you want to do it. But these are just prompts of things to ask yourself and conversations to have. So if somebody says, hey, what if we did this? Wouldn't that be awesome? Which happens a lot, right? Oh, I wish that software did this. I wish our product did this. Then you can take that and you can say, all right, well, what's the problem that that's solving? And if you don't have a really compelling problem that it's solving, you know right away, like, this is probably not worth our time. But if you've got a really compelling problem, then you say, okay, well, who's the user that's going to benefit from this? Who are the customers that are actually going to use this? What are the solutions today that relate to this? Do we already have something that could be modified slightly rather than building this whole new feature? Business challenges, budget, benefits, adoption strategy. Will people actually use it if we build it? Anyway, that's the idea. Okay. I'm sure there are lots of other ways that you can get clarity on what to add to your map. And I guess the nice thing about it being a living document is you can add as much as you want and then trim it away as you're making decisions. So which was my next question. How do I decide what to build? So, okay, I've got a map. We think that this is all good stuff, but what actually makes it into my backlog? What are the stories that we're actually going to make? What are the, how do we decide on the supporting documents that need to be created? What are we going to wireframe? Or what are we going to model out? Or et cetera, et cetera. So this is pretty textbook approach to the story mapping thing. Basically, after you make your map, you've got your backbone, you start breaking things down into reasonable releases. This kind of factors into a conversation about MVP, which is kind of interesting. The short version is there are a lot of different definitions for MVP, for minimum viable product. Every organization is a little different. Some people take the approach, like the original, when the term first came out, it was really meant to mean the smallest, most awesome release that you can do. So you say, all right, we're going to build this much, but we're going to make sure that it's really awesome so that when we push it out, it's successful. Later, with the lean startup, it started being used as more of like a test. So if I'm building an MVP, it's really just, something loose and wild that we can put out there and learn from, right? Like let's release this to just a few people and see how it does. We didn't spend much time on it. It's the minimum viable thing. But unfortunately, those have kind of gotten mixed up, and most companies have a definition that's more like, what's the crap that we can push out the fastest, and that's what an MVP is. And that's important to understand if you're working in an organization, what that means to your org. But anyway, that's kind of an aside. I would hope that it's more the original, which is let's get clear on like the smallest thing that we can build that will have the most impact, and then let's prove that out and get it into the market so that we can start learning from it. Anyway, so basically, like if we had done our map here and then we have the details underneath, once we build the map, then we say, all right, how can we trim this thing down? Let's really slim this thing as much as we can. What's not relevant? What do we not need? What can wait until later? And you thin it out, and then you start doing that breakdown. You say, okay, first we're going to do these pieces. So for managing a calendar, these are the critical pieces that have to be there for this to release. If they're not there, then people can't even use it. Then in our next release, we'll enhance that with these pieces. And then if that goes well, we haven't changed everything by then, which you do the first release and go, oh, well, it turns out nobody likes managed calendars, so we can just ditch this whole thing, right? That's the nice thing about not loading your backlog, all of this stuff at first, because you may not even need it, or maybe you'll need to change it somehow. Anyway, so you get your first release, you maybe spec out a second release. From what I've seen, it's rare that you go past the second release. And then you've got a plan, you've got all this other stuff that you can consider once you get to that point. Anyway, does that make sense? Here's another like real life example of this kind of process. Actually, it's a little different. What I think why I put this in here was to talk about the supporting stuff, because that's really important too. Like, because it's about the conversation and the shared understanding, like it's not all about just the map. It's about the stuff around the map. So as you're exploring things, as you're testing things out, you'll make a wireframe. Maybe you print it out and you put it on here and say, all right, this is what the wireframe looks like. Or in an existing product, maybe it would be beneficial if you're mapping things out to say, these things exist now. And how does that factor into the conversation? And what needs to change, what needs to be axed or whatever. So anyway, so you see some UI here. I don't know what else they've got going on. See, these look like personas maybe. But anyway, having that context around your conversation is really valuable and can help you make better choices about what actually goes into your backlog. So I think I already mentioned it. I've got other questions. How do you get more stakeholders involved, and how can they participate? Like, if it's all about the conversation, then do they have to be there for every conversation, or is there a way to communicate the knowledge to other people who may need to know that kind of stuff? How do you determine when you're breaking things out what is a release that is truly viable versus other things that you need to build to test, to send out to just a few users and understand better before you move forward with it. Anyway, there's a lot of like practical stuff that I don't understand about user story mapping, but overall, I really like these 2 points. These really resonated with me, which is you need shared understanding. All too often, we create these documents, they get pushed along, and when somebody picks them up, they think they know what it means, and they don't really know what it means, or it's different than the person who wrote it. So having more conversations, that's a big takeaway for me. And then also being really careful about what you commit to building, because you can't build everything. Just like Gary, you're going to run out of money. There will always be more ideas and more features, more possibilities than what you have time and resources for. So be choosy, have the conversations, figure out, talk from a user's perspective and figure out what it is that they actually do and what problems they actually are up against. And as you do that and as you map that out, then you can get a better sense for what will actually solve their problems, rather than just guessing with a list of features. I think that's it. That's it. Any questions? No guarantees that I can actually answer any of them.
You go over the flow of the morning?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I didn't. It was more the seeing the activity in action that I was worried about. When did you get dressed?
I think you had a shower detail.
I was going to say. Okay, interesting that there are times here. Woke up at 5:30, 5:45. Early risers. Get out of bed.
They're just showing off.
I showered precisely at 6:45. Who was that? I don't know what time I got in the shower. Impressed that you know. Brush teeth, shave. This is a good one. Like if we had some women here, it would be interesting to have a conversation about what shaving means in this map. Showering. got in car. So this theoretically would be over here in the story. Hopefully, after getting dressed. Yeah. Drove downtown, dropped off machines, cooked breakfast. How this had looked for a second. Rest, ate breakfast. So, yeah, the breakfast is here. Clean the dishes. But somebody did that. Somebody kissed their wife. This is a few others for that.
I put that down for Jonathan.
Four.
You needed brownie points.
There you go. Okay, any other questions? Terrific. Well, thanks for coming. I really appreciate you being here.